Hi, my name is Manuela Lehmann and I work as a project curator for the Amara West project at the British Museum. Welcome to my corner. That was horrible. Never mind. So Amara West is a pharaonic settlement in what we call now Nubia. This is modern northern Sudan. And this is a settlement of pharaonic Egyptians, and we also excavated some of their tombs. So it's very nice to have a comparison of the material between the finds from the settlements and from the tombs. When we look at the pharaonic Egyptian culture, we can see that the people were often buried in coffins, in tombs, and these people often get things from their daily lives placed with them in the tombs. So for example, beds, but also chairs or boxes or things like that. And if we look at the Nubian culture, we can see that in Nubia, people are also buried with beds, but in a different way. So in Nubia, the bodies are often placed directly on top of the beds. They are buried with, for example, leather hides or something like that. So we can see that in both cultures, we find beds in the tombs, but they are treated in a different way. So when we excavate in Sudan, we usually have an inspector from NCAM with us, and for many years Mohamed has been working for us in Amara West.
My name is Mohamed Saad from National Corporation for Antiquities and Museum, Sudan.
Excavation at Amara West cemetery provide us many wooden objects, and most important the bed, we call it angareeb. It is sometimes well preserved and sometimes it is a fragment. To work cemetery in Amara West project sometimes very easy and sometimes is really difficult. Depends on how they bury their relatives, and sometimes it is very deep, sometimes it's shallow, sometimes it's not far from the surface. But with some hard work, we get to dig all the graves there. I like working in tombs because I found myself there. Or I find myself there.
People usually think that we find sort of complete, very nicely preserved beds, but it's not always the case. So most of the bulk material we find looks like this. So we have to go through each and every fragment and see if we can identify what one of this was originally. Yeah?
You must be very good at jigsaw puzzles.
I love jigsaw puzzles. Comes in handy when you get the job, yeah. So yeah, by starting to study these wooden fragments, the beds were easiest to identify. And if you walk around in the modern Nubian villages, you will see a lot of wooden beds that are very similar. They're not identical, but they have a lot of things in common. So of course, while I worked on them, it was just natural to go around and see, because almost any Nubian house, also the house where we live in, will have one old wooden bed in a corner somewhere. So just walking around and looking at these beds, you start comparing them and see what's different, what's the same. So it started to get very interesting for me to understand my ancient fragments better. We tried to find local Nubian carpenters, and that actually turned out to be really difficult, because in the last 20 years or so, people switched to metal beds, and less people ask for the wooden beds because they have termites in their houses, they don't last as long. So we sort of started realizing that this is a really important cultural tradition, and it's just completely dying now. Eventually we were lucky and found several carpenters. One of these carpenters, his name is Mustafa, lives on the island of Magassia Island by Kerma. And on an island context, often traditions are kept a bit longer than on the main land. So on Magassia Island, people still ask to get wooden angareeb beds made. So he had a much more in-depth knowledge of how to make these beds and what's used for the stringing and all sorts of stuff.
It was successful to find Mustafa, because he's a really patient guy and he's really nice, and he's intelligent to making angareeb and really super fast. We asked him to make like modern angareeb compared to the old angareeb. I think this give also an idea how the old people they make their angareeb, and also we can just open mind for many students. They can look for the other things similar to angareeb. They can do their studies for this heritage, and now it is just lost by the modern things, plastic and metals and
Obviously, when you study these objects, you come up with a lot of questions and you can't really ask anybody anymore. But for a modern carpenter, it's really nice, because you can ask him, like, why do you do this like this, and why do you take this tool and not that tool, and things like that. So that was really a big advantage for us. Mustafa came to us and lived with us for about 10 days on Aneta Island. And so we showed him our ancient fragments to see what he thinks about them. And we showed him like drawings of them as well. And yeah, he was very surprised because the fragments are quite small. So the modern bed legs are a bit more larger in size and also a bit sturdier. So, and he was also very impressed by the fine decoration of the ancient peoples. We tried him to reproduce some of them, and he came from this modern perspective, and we kept saying like, can you make this a bit smaller? And he was always afraid that it would break in the end. And that is one of the big questions we also had for our ancient fragments. So some of them are so small, and it happens sometimes that objects are only made for the tombs. They were not really used in life. So one of the questions we had, could these ancient beds actually support the weight of a full body and a coffin? Or would they just be made for the tombs, and then you would close the tomb and hope it doesn't collapse? And so I don't know, but if anybody of you has ever made a bed, I haven't, I would just go to my local store and buy one. But if I would ever have to make one, I would probably go to a do-it-yourself store and just buy planks. As a Nubian carpenter, you just go and you start with a piece of tree, so you don't have the planks, you actually have to make the planks. He brought chunks of wood that he would then make into planks, and he brought halfa grass with him and showed us how to make the rope as well. So he also showed us how to twist the rope, how to tighten it, how to string it, and how to do different patterns. So what I thought was really interesting is that they don't use any measurement tools, but all the measurements are based on pieces of your body. So they use cubits and handspans and fingers. So when we came and said, oh, Mustafa, can you make this bed like 35 centimeters high? And he was like, how many handspans or fingers is that actually? So that was really interesting to see. And that is something that we can see in the ancient Egyptian times as well. So all the measurements are based on exactly the same parts. So it would be the cubits, the handspans, and the fingers that are still used nowadays. So he would produce one leg, and then the other 3 legs he would always lie next to the first one and then take the measurements from the first one to make sure they are all in the same size. The English introduced the so-called neem tree to Egypt, and that's a tree that, according to Mustafa, tastes very bitter, so the termites don't like it so much. So that's why the carpenters really like to use neem tree nowadays. But they also still use acacia, that is a local tree, and that's very hard wood, so that's very good for the bed legs. And we identified some of our ancient fragments, and they are also sometimes made out of acacia wood. It's really nice to have this modern Nubian bed now as part of our collection, so that future generations can come and do research on it. And also for us, still doing the research on the ancient fragment, it's still very useful to have a comparison material within our collection. I would just like to thank everybody who helped us doing this project, and thank you for watching. We hope you enjoy this, and this was just a small sub-project from one excavation that the British Museum is doing. So let us know if you are interested in other bits or if you want to hear other stuff about digging. Thanks for watching. I feel like a news reporter. This is so stupid.